So let's go ahead and jump back to the resource pack directory, and let's go ahead and open up the using references and functions step. That's number 13. Go ahead and copy the code and paste it over the code that's currently in your test.php file and save it. Now the functions that we've looked at so far follow this structure. We pass it a parameter, and then we can use that value inside of the function and do something with it and then return a value. What might feel a little fuzzy is what exactly this variable is. So with a normal function call like we've been doing before, the data that we pass in actually becomes a separate variable as soon as the function runs. So if we run this function called function with no reference and we pass it this parameter variable, and then we change the value of this variable here by adding some text to the beginning of it, it won't actually change the variable outside of the scope of this function. So the way we can test this is by taking a variable. Here's our variable. It's a string that says this is the original value, and then we're going to pass that variable into function with no reference. Now, if that variable changes and we get that text added, when we print the variable, we would see that text added to the variable. Let's go ahead and save this and jump to the browser and refresh, and we see that it says this is the original value. So our variable hasn't changed at all. I'm going to go ahead and jump back to the editor. If we wanted to capture these changes, we would need to add a line that returned the variable, and then here we would need to reassign the return value from this function back to my variable. Now all of that might sound a little confusing, and that's okay. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example where this isn't the case anymore. So the second function is called function with reference. Notice that the structure is identical to this function above, but the only difference is that we have this ampersand in front of the variable name. So for this function, we're adding some text to the beginning that says this variable was passed into a function and modified, and then we're adding the variable value to it, and we're assigning that back to variable. So if we're working with a typical parameter, we would expect that since there's no return line in this function, we wouldn't get any value back. So let's go ahead and comment out this first couple of lines where we demonstrate the no reference example, and let's uncomment out the next couple of lines where we use function with reference. So again, we're using the same my variable, which has the value of this is the original value. We're passing it into function with reference, and then we're printing that variable. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the browser after saving this and refresh. So notice that now our variable says this variable was passed into a function and modified, and then this is the original value. Let's jump back to the editor. So what's happening here is that we're passing a variable by reference by using this little ampersand here. This says that this variable here is a pointer to the original variable. We're not creating a new variable at all. So when we manipulate this variable inside of the function, it changes the value without having to return anything. Now something that might be a little bit confusing is that the variable name here is called my variable, and the variable name here is just called variable. Now we can have different names for these. We can name this pointer anything that we'd like, and it will still point to this original variable. But within the context of this function, we need to use this name rather than the original variable name that we passed into the function. So notice that we're using variable here and variable here instead of my variable. Now there's clear advantages to using a reference like this. Our code can be simplified a bit because we no longer have to have a return value. But it can also be dangerous, especially if the users who are going to be using the functions don't necessarily know that it's going to be a reference passing, because it can inadvertently change the data without that being the intention. Most of the time, you don't need to use this structure, and you can use the original structure where you pass a variable in and it becomes another variable. But at some point you might see that things can be simplified a bit by using a reference